Karma isn't some mystical force that punishes the avoidant for the pain they've caused. It's the inevitable consequence of their own patterns, the natural result of years spent running from intimacy and rejecting connection. The avoidance karma unfolds quietly, not through dramatic external punishment, but through the slow accumulation of internal emptiness. They don't suffer because the universe is balancing scales. They suffer because the walls they built to protect themselves eventually become the prison they can't escape. The relationships they sabotaged, the people they pushed away, the vulnerability they refused, these don't haunt them immediately. The karma arrives later, often years later, when they're alone with the architecture of isolation they constructed, when they finally want connection but have forgotten how to build it, when everyone who once tried to love them has moved on to people capable of loving them back. The avoidance karma isn't punishment, it's consequence. It's the natural outcome of choosing safety over connection so consistently that safety becomes indistinguishable from solitude. Protection becomes isolation, and autonomy becomes loneliness that no amount of self-sufficiency can fill. The loneliness they cultivated through constant withdrawal, the avoidant spends years, sometimes decades, perfecting the art of emotional withdrawal. Every time connection deepens, they retreat. Every time someone gets close, they create distance. Every time vulnerability is required, they deflect or disappear. These withdrawals feel protective in the moment, like necessary maintenance of boundaries, like self-preservation against the threat of being consumed or controlled. But each withdrawal plants a seed of loneliness that germinates slowly, invisibly, until one day the avoidant looks around and realizes they're surrounded by space they created but no longer want. This loneliness doesn't announce itself suddenly. It accumulates gradually, building in the background, while the avoidant focuses on maintaining their independence and protecting their autonomy. In their younger years, the loneliness might be masked by the excitement of new connections, by the validation of being pursued, by the comfort of knowing they can always find someone willing to try to reach them. But as time passes, as the pattern repeats across multiple relationships, as people eventually stop pursuing and start protecting themselves, the loneliness begins to reveal itself in ways that can't be ignored or rationalized away. The avoidant discovers that the independence they fought so hard to maintain feels less like freedom and more like isolation. The solitude they once enjoyed as a refuge from intimacy's demands now feels empty, devoid of the richness that comes from being truly known by another person. They have space, yes. They have autonomy, yes. They have freedom from the pressure and expectations that relationships bring, yes. But they also have an aching absence where deep connection should be, a hollowness that all their self-sufficiency can't fill, a nagging awareness that something fundamental is missing from their life. This loneliness is particularly painful because it's self-inflicted. The avoidant can't blame external circumstances or other people's failures. They can't claim they were abandoned or betrayed or treated poorly. They were the ones who created distance. They were the ones who rejected intimacy. They were the ones who chose withdrawal over vulnerability time and time again. This recognition strips away the comfort of victimhood and forces the avoidant to confront their own role in their isolation. The loneliness comes with the burden of accountability, the knowledge that they constructed this prison themselves, brick by brick through thousands of small choices to protect rather than connect. The karma of this loneliness intensifies as the avoidant ages and their capacity for attracting new connection diminishes. In youth, there's always another person willing to try, another relationship to begin, another chance to do things differently. But with age comes a shrinking pool of available partners, a hardening of patterns that become more difficult to change, a weariness in others who can recognize avoidant patterns quickly and choose not to engage. The avoidant finds that the strategies that once protected them now trap them. The emotional unavailability that once felt like strength now reads as limitation. The independence that once seemed attractive now appears as inability to truly partner with another human being. The loneliness also carries a specific quality that distinguishes it from ordinary solitude. It's the loneliness of being unknown, of having kept everyone at such careful distance that no one has ever seen the full truth of who the avoidant is beneath their defenses. The avoidant has acquaintances perhaps and surface level friendships, but no one who knows their fears, their wounds, their genuine emotional interior. This kind of loneliness persists even in rooms full of people, even in the midst of social engagement, because it stems not from physical isolation, but from emotional concealment. The avoidant is alone with themselves in a way that becomes increasingly unbearable as the years accumulate. The avoidant begins to notice the loneliness most acutely in moments that would traditionally be shared. Achievements feel hollow without someone who genuinely cares to celebrate them. Difficulties feel heavier without someone to turn to for support. Joy feels muted without someone to amplify it through shared experience. The avoidant has trained themselves to be self-sufficient in all these moments, to not need others to find satisfaction in solitary experience. But self-sufficiency, they discover, is not the same as fulfillment. Being capable of handling everything alone is not the same as wanting to handle everything alone. The loneliness reveals the difference between independence as a choice and isolation as a consequence. This cultivated loneliness also manifests in the avoidance relationship with their own emotional life. Because they've spent so long suppressing feelings, avoiding vulnerability, and disconnecting from their own needs, they become strangers to themselves. They don't know what they truly want because they've spent decades focusing on what they don't want: pressure, obligation, dependency, loss of control. They don't know how to identify their feelings because they've trained themselves to bypass emotional awareness in favor of rational analysis. They're lonely, not just in their lack of connection to others, but in their disconnection from their own inner world. The karma is complete isolation, both external and internal, and the avoidant sits in the center of it, wondering how protecting themselves so carefully led to this profound sense of being utterly alone. The loss of people who won't return the avoidance karma includes the permanent loss of people who genuinely love them, who tried repeatedly to build connection, who endured cycles of closeness and distance until they finally reached their limit and walked away. These people don't leave because they stopped caring. They leave because caring without reciprocation becomes unsustainable, because waiting for emotional availability that never fully materializes erodes self-worth, because choosing themselves becomes more important than remaining available for someone who can't consistently choose them back. When they leave completely, and the avoidant eventually realizes that some doors, once closed, don't reopen. In the immediate aftermath of these departures, the avoidant typically feels relief. The pressure lifts, the expectations disappear, the space they craved becomes available without guilt or conflict. They might even feel vindicated, as though the person leaving proves that others are unreliable, that depending on people leads to abandonment, that their self-protective strategies were justified all along. But this relief is temporary. It fades as the avoidant begins to recognize what they've actually lost, and that recognition often arrives too late to repair what's been broken. The karma manifests when the avoidant finally develops enough self-awareness to understand what those departed people offered and how rare that offering was. They begin to see that the person who tolerated their emotional unavailability wasn't weak or desperate, but rather someone with extraordinary capacity for patience and love. They recognized that the person who kept trying to bridge the gap wasn't clingy or demanding, but rather someone who valued connection enough to persist through difficulty. They realized that the person who finally walked away didn't do so lightly, but after exhausting every possible avenue for making the relationship work. This recognition arrives when the person is gone, when their number is blocked, when they've built a new life that doesn't include the avoidant, when they found someone capable of the reciprocity the avoidant couldn't provide. The avoidant discovers that people who love deeply don't love infinitely. There's a threshold where continued investment in someone emotionally unavailable transforms from dedication into self-abandonment, and healthy people eventually recognize that threshold and honor it. The people who left weren't giving up prematurely, they were protecting themselves from the slow erosion of spending years waiting for someone to be ready for what they've been ready for all along. The avoidant who spent the relationship controlling distance and managing closeness on their terms suddenly has no control at all. The person is simply gone, and no amount of breadcrumbs or sudden availability will bring them back. This loss carries particular weight because it's often the loss of someone who saw the avoidant's potential, who believed in their capacity for growth, who held space for their wounds while also hoping they would heal. These people weren't trying to change the avoidant out of judgment or control. They were hoping the avoidant would change because they could see who the avoidant might become if they addressed their fears. Losing someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway, who knew your limitations and stayed present anyway, who weathered your withdrawals and kept returning anyway, that loss is profound. It's the loss of someone who offered exactly the kind of unconditional positive regard that the avoidant's early experiences taught them didn't exist. The karma intensifies when the avoidant later encounters other people and recognizes how different those interactions feel. New connections don't carry the same depth because they haven't weathered the same storms. New people don't know the avoidant's history, don't understand their patterns, don't see past their defenses to the vulnerable person underneath. The avoidant realizes that the person who left had accumulated years of knowledge about who they truly are, had developed understanding that can't be replicated quickly, had built a foundation of shared experience that made the relationship irreplaceable. Starting over means beginning from scratch with people who might not have the patience or investment to persist through the avoidant's inevitable distancing patterns. The avoidant also faces the reality that the people who left have shared their experiences with others, not out of malice, but as part of processing their own pain and healing. The avoidant's reputation precedes them now. People in their social circle know about the patterns, the withdrawals, the inability to sustain intimacy. This knowledge creates a protective barrier where new potential partners approach with caution, if they approach at all. The avoidant finds that their past has consequences in their present, that the way they treated people who love them has created a legacy that makes future connection more difficult. They can't escape their own history because it lives in the memories and stories of everyone they've pushed away. The loss of people who won't return also means the loss of futures that will never materialize. The avoidant might have imagined in some distant way that those people would always be available, that they could return when they were finally ready, that the relationship could resume when they'd done enough work to show up differently. But people move on. They build lives with partners who can meet them emotionally. They have children with people who won't withdraw when family life becomes demanding. They create homes and histories with individuals capable of sustained presence. The avoidant is left watching from a distance as the person who once centered their life around them now centers their life around someone else, someone who could do what the avoidant couldn't. This aspect of karma is particularly cruel because it involves the avoidant's own growth timeline working against them. Many avoidants do eventually develop more secure attachment patterns, do eventually recognize their role in relationship failures, do eventually become capable of the vulnerability and consistency they couldn't access earlier. But this growth often arrives after the people who would have celebrated it are no longer in their life. The avoidant becomes ready for connection precisely when the people who wanted that connection have exhausted their willingness to wait. The timing is permanently misaligned, and the avoidant must live with the knowledge that they had access to something valuable and lost it. Not because it was taken from them, but because they pushed it away until it stopped coming back. The inability to trust their own patterns, the avoidance karma, includes a profound crisis of self-trust that emerges when they finally recognize their patterns and understand the damage those patterns have caused. For years, the avoidant operated with certainty that their way of relating was correct, that their need for distance was legitimate, that their discomfort with intimacy was justified self-protection. They trusted their instincts to withdraw, their impulses to create space, their assessments that relationships were threatening. But when those patterns consistently produce the same painful outcomes, loneliness, loss, isolation, the avoidant begins to question whether their internal guidance system has been leading them towards safety or away from everything that makes life meaningful. This erosion of self-trust manifests as paralysis when new relationship opportunities arise. The avoidant feels attracted to someone, senses potential for connection, experiences the early excitement of getting to know another person, but now they carry the weight of their history. They know what they've done before, they know how they've sabotaged connection, they know that their nervous system will eventually register intimacy as threat and trigger withdrawal regardless of how much they consciously want things to be different. This knowledge creates a split between what they want and what they trust themselves to do, and that split makes authentic engagement with new people feel impossible. The avoidant can no longer trust their feelings of being overwhelmed or suffocated in relationships because they've learned that those feelings emerge not from genuine threat, but from proximity to intimacy itself. When a new partner wants to spend time together, when someone expresses emotional needs, when a relationship begins to deepen, the avoidant's body responds with familiar anxiety. But now they don't know whether that anxiety signals a legitimate boundary violation or simply their attachment system activating its default programming. They can't distinguish between intuition worth honoring and trauma responses worth challenging. Their internal compass, once their primary navigation tool, has been revealed as potentially unreliable, and they're left uncertain how to move forward. This inability to trust their patterns also creates doubt about their assessments of other people. The avoidant has a history of interpreting normal relationship needs as excessive demands, of experiencing healthy expressions of care as attempts at control, of reading closeness as threat to autonomy. They've labeled partners as needy, clingy, demanding, intense, labels that justified their withdrawal and protected their self-image. But with growing awareness, the avoidant begins to question whether those assessments were accurate. Were their partners actually too much, or was the avoidant simply too defended? Were the relationships actually suffocating, or was the avoidant unable to tolerate normal interdependence? This questioning undermines their ability to evaluate new people accurately because their judgment has been compromised by years of distorted perception. The karma of self-distrust extends into the avoidance decisions about whether to pursue relationships at all. Part of them recognizes that connection is essential to well-being, that isolation isn't sustainable, that they need to engage differently if they want different results. But another part knows how powerful their patterns are, how automatically they activate, how little conscious control they've demonstrated when those patterns assert themselves. The avoidant becomes afraid of hurting others the way they've hurt people in the past. They genuinely don't want to cause more pain, don't want to repeat the cycle of drawing someone close only to push them away. This fear can lead to preemptive withdrawal from any potential connection, a self-imposed isolation that feels more ethical than engaging with people they might inevitably hurt. The avoidant also loses trust in their capacity to sustain change. They might enter therapy, read about attachment, commit to doing things differently. They might have moments of genuine breakthrough, periods where they feel more secure, times when they believe they've finally shifted beyond their old patterns. But then stress arrives or intimacy deepens past a certain threshold and the old programming reasserts itself. They find themselves withdrawing despite their commitment not to, creating distance despite their intention to stay close, reverting to familiar protective strategies despite knowing those strategies no longer serve them. These relapses into old behavior erode their confidence that lasting change is possible, leaving them uncertain whether effort toward growth will ever produce sustainable transformation. This self-distrust creates a particular kind of suffering because it removes the avoidance sense of agency. When they trusted their patterns, they felt in control. They might have been isolated, but that isolation was chosen, was managed, was the result of deliberate decisions to protect themselves. Now, recognizing that those patterns are maladaptive, but feeling unable to override them, the avoidant experiences themselves as trapped by their own psychology. They're no longer choosing isolation consciously. They're being driven toward it by attachment wounds they can't seem to heal, by nervous system responses they can't seem to regulate, by deeply ingrained defensive patterns that activate automatically despite conscious desires for something different. The inability to trust their patterns also means the avoidant can no longer trust their interpretation of whether relationships are working or failing. They know they've ended good relationships because intimacy triggered their defenses. They know they've interpreted partners' healthy needs as pressure. They know they've abandoned connections that were actually safe because safety itself felt threatening. This history makes it impossible to confidently assess current or future relationships. When discomfort arises, the avoidant can't determine whether it's signaling genuine incompatibility or simply their attachment system responding to closeness. When they want to leave, they can't know if they're making a wise choice or repeating a destructive pattern. Every decision becomes suspect, filtered through awareness of their compromised judgment. The karma of self-distrust leaves the avoidant in a state of chronic uncertainty about their own reliability as a partner and their own perception as a judge of relationships. They're caught between knowing they need to change and doubting their capacity to change, between wanting connection and fearing their inability to sustain it, between recognizing their patterns as problematic and feeling controlled by those same patterns. This internal conflict creates paralysis where the avoidant feels unable to move confidently in any direction toward relationships or away from them, toward vulnerability or toward protection, toward trust in themselves or toward acceptance of their limitations. The very instincts that once felt like reliable guides to self-preservation now feel like sabotage actively working against the avoidant's conscious desires for meaningful connection. The hollow victory of getting everything they thought they wanted, the final and perhaps most devastating aspect of the avoidance karma arrives when they achieve everything they believed would make them happy: complete autonomy, freedom from obligation, independence from others' needs, space to live entirely on their own terms, and discover that these achievements feel empty rather than fulfilling. The avoidants spent years fighting for freedom from intimacy's demands, protecting their autonomy against relationship encroachment, maintaining strict boundaries to preserve their sense of self. They imagined that if they could just have enough space, enough independence, enough freedom from others' expectations, they would finally feel satisfied, secure, content. The karma is getting exactly what they wanted and discovering it isn't what they needed at all. This hollow victory reveals itself gradually. The avoidant has successfully eliminated the pressure of relationships. No one is asking where they are or when they'll be home. No one is expressing disappointment about their emotional unavailability. No one is requesting more time, more presence, more vulnerability. The calendar is entirely their own. The evenings are uninterrupted. The weekends are self-directed. Every choice is made without consideration of another person's needs or preferences. This should feel liberating. Instead, it often feels meaningless. The freedom they fought for becomes freedom without purpose, autonomy without direction, independence that highlights the absence of anyone who cares how that independence is used. The avoidant discovers that human beings are fundamentally relational creatures, that meaning in life often comes through connection with others, that the self they were so carefully protecting only fully develops in relationship. The autonomy they preserved so vigilantly turns out to be autonomy in isolation, which is a fundamentally different experience than autonomy within connection. They're free, yes, but free to do what? Free for what purpose? Free in service of what vision for their life? Without relationships to provide context, without people who matter to them and to whom they matter. The freedom feels untethered, purposeless, a victory that won the battle but lost the war for a meaningful life. This realization often arrives during moments that would traditionally be shared. The avoidant experiences something beautiful, a sunset, a piece of music, an achievement, a moment of unexpected joy, and has no one to tell. The experience happens, registers briefly, then fades because it isn't amplified through sharing. They realize that experiences gain significance through being witnessed by someone who cares, that accomplishments feel hollow without someone who understands their importance, that joy multiplies when reflected in another person's genuine happiness for you. The avoidant has eliminated the witnesses from their life, and in doing so has diminished the texture and significance of lived experience itself. The hollow victory also manifests in the avoidant's relationship with difficulty and suffering. When challenges arise, illness, loss, professional setbacks, existential crisis, the avoidant faces them alone. They have the autonomy they wanted, which means they also have complete responsibility for managing everything that goes wrong. There's no one to share the burden, no one to offer perspective, no one whose presence alone provides comfort. The self-sufficiency they cultivated becomes self-reliance by necessity rather than choice. And they discover that being capable of handling everything alone is not the same as wanting to handle everything alone. The weight of managing life's difficulties without support becomes crushing in ways that the weight of others' expectations never was. The avoidant also confronts the reality that the self they protected so carefully never develops its full potential without the friction and growth that relationships provide. We learn who we are partly through seeing ourselves reflected in others' eyes, through being challenged by people who see us differently than we see ourselves, through the growth that occurs when we have to accommodate another person's reality alongside our own. The avoidant, having avoided this relational friction, finds that they've remained psychologically static in important ways. They know themselves deeply in some respects, their preferences, their routines, their internal landscape, but they don't know who they could become in genuine partnership. What strengths might emerge through sustained vulnerability? What aspects of themselves remain dormant because they were never called forth by someone else's presence? The karma of this hollow victory includes recognizing that the things the avoidant dismissed as unimportant, emotional intimacy, interdependence, being needed by someone, having someone to rely on, are actually fundamental to human well-being. The avoidant spent years minimizing the importance of these elements, telling themselves that needing others was weakness, that emotional connection was optional, that self-sufficiency was superior to mutual dependency. But the absence of these elements creates a life that functions smoothly on the surface while feeling profoundly empty at its core. The avoidant has optimized for efficiency and autonomy while starving the parts of themselves that hunger for belonging, significance in another's life, the particular kind of meaning that only relationships provide. The hollow victory becomes most painful when the avoidant finally wants to change direction, but discovers how difficult changing course has become. The life they've built is structured around their independence. They have no practice in emotional vulnerability. They have no current relationships deep enough to serve as foundation for greater intimacy. They have patterns so ingrained that they activate automatically despite conscious intentions to behave differently. They've become expert at a way of living that no longer serves them, and they don't know how to become beginner again at connection. The skills atrophy through disuse. The opportunities narrow with age. The willingness of others to engage with someone so defended diminishes as people learn to protect themselves from unavailable partners. The final aspect of this karma is the recognition that arrives too late to prevent the damage, but early enough to fully experience its consequences. The avoidant understands eventually that they've spent decades solving the wrong problem. They thought the problem was other people's needs threatening their autonomy. The actual problem was their own inability to tolerate the vulnerability that real connection requires. They thought the solution was creating enough distance to feel safe. The actual solution would have been addressing the wounds that made closeness feel dangerous. They won the battle for independence and lost the opportunity for the kind of rich, meaningful, connected life that makes independence worth having. They stand victorious and alone, having defeated every attempt at intimacy, having protected themselves so thoroughly that protection became its own form of suffering, having achieved exactly what they thought they wanted, only to discover that what they wanted was based on fear rather than wisdom, on trauma rather than truth, on protection of a self that never gets to fully develop, because development requires exactly the kind of vulnerable connection they spent their entire life avoiding.